Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, bonus episode.
Bonus episode.
Yeah, but you know that already because you are a subscriber on our Patreon. A thing that we are so grateful for, and welcome back.
Yeah, you're the few, the proud. We're back here again. We just finished recording episode 47, so we've got Lana and Kory with us still.
Woo! Hey! Yeah, and you listened to that episode, so we don't need to explain to you how awesome that AI episode was.
It was so awesome.
Yeah, if you thought it was awesome, click like.
I didn't think it could possibly be better than the movie with Haley Joel Osment, but it was.
It was.
I say dead, baby. Not that movie.
So for this bonus episode, we're blessed with two great minds here, and one of which, Lana Cuthbertson, works for the nonprofit parityyeg or parityyeg for those that are in the know. Which is their purpose is parity in politics.
Yes.
Gender parity specifically, right?
Gender parity, yes.
Right. You don't give a shit about racial
Don't
parity.
care at all, no.
Yes.
You agreed too quickly.
So we're going to start off talking a little bit about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the kind of like modern influx of women in Congress, and who knows where we'll go from there. There's lots of interesting stuff to talk about. So actually, maybe Lana, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about parityyeg, as the kids say, and the work that you do.
Great. So, I live in Edmonton for the most part, and we there's a group of us, about 6 of us, who are the leaders of this organization. It's nonprofit and volunteer run, so it's a working board that runs this group. And what we wanted to do was see if we could get 50% of the candidates to be women in Edmonton's elections. So Edmonton's municipal election is obviously very close, but there are people elected in Edmonton at the provincial level, at the federal level, to school boards, that type of thing. So we're really actively driving towards a goal of getting more women to run for political office. And that's what the organization is dedicated to. And it's about women in politics, and we also, obviously, an important part of that is intersectionality. So thinking about women of different racial backgrounds and different sexual orientations as well.
Cool.
And so I one thing I picked up there that I really loved is that your goal is to get more women to run.
Yes.
Not necessarily to get more women elected.
Yes, and it's an interesting strategy to choose. And the reason we chose it is because it really, in our opinion, is a more sustainable way to change. So what you often see is, why are all these women running in the same race and they're all running against each other? Well, that's a great thing. Wouldn't it be great if that was happening all the time? What happens is, if you focus about getting more women elected and in positions, obviously that's the ultimate goal. That's what you want. But there are ways that you can think about that strategically to say, okay, we'll just run one woman here, and for me that's not really what it's about. That feels like a bit of a shortcut. So
Right.
it's about getting women running.
Well, as like Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said when she was first appointed to the Supreme Court, somebody said, how many women will be enough on the Supreme Court for equality? And she said 9. Like all of them. And people were shocked, and she said, well, there were 9 men for so much of history. Like, when there's 9 women, that's when we'll have reached equality, right? So I think it's tempting to sometimes look at equality as like 50-50 when, in fact, things have been so disproportionate historically, and those effects have carried into the modern day so much that you actually have to kind of weight things the other way in order to create true equality.
Yeah, well, and I like I agree. The thing I liked about it was it does feel more sustainable. Like, I'm going to relate this to my own life. As many of the listeners know, I'm an actor, and I often tell like students of mine that it's not about booking the job. It's about making the list of people that might book the job. So it's about, instead of a callback is as good as getting the part. The only difference between getting called back and getting the part is the director's opinion on who he or she thinks fits the script the best. And you can't influence that. The only thing you can influence is like making a call, putting in your letter, getting seen for an audition.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that you can change. And the more often you make the list, theoretically, the more often you get it. And and there's no entitlement there. There's still like a as you say, like the way you've described it, I feel like I can hear As soon as I hear someone say like we need more women elected, I can hear the right wing people being like, well, that's an unfair way of thinking about it. Like people should be elected on their on their policies and their points of view, not on their gender. But as soon as you put it the other way of I just want more women to be considered, you go, oh yeah, that will result in have the same result, and it's a little less not aggressive, but like a little. I can see people taking less issue with it.
Totally. You're absolutely right. We hear a lot about like quotas. It's such a weird word. People don't like the word quotas. They don't like the concept of quotas. But if you kind of shift it and think about it a little bit differently in terms of maybe more in terms of goals or in terms of if the argument against quotas is you're just putting people there because of kind of their only a certain narrow part of their identity instead of the merit or the experience or the value they're going to bring, then you really quickly get to the point of like, okay, well, because of the way our culture is, we've been putting people in positions because of their identity and not because of their experience for a very long time.
Yeah,
so we're missing out on that broad experience, and that's why we want to change the culture.
Yeah, meritocracy is like a convenient myth that you can often just employ to prevent people from getting in stature.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it is interesting too. Like sexism is super real. I think there's an infamous thing in the classical music world where there was like long-standing discrimination against women in orchestras, and they actually switched. So now when you audition for orchestras, it's a blind audition. The panel can't see the musician. They can't see if they're a man or a woman. They just hear the playing. And that change massively increased the representation for women in orchestras.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story because I use that story all the time.
Right, okay.
And it was blind auditions.
We didn't coordinate about that.
So it's a really interesting way that evolved. The blind auditions, they basically closed the curtains and said, okay, just listen. But there was still a discrimination. There was still more men getting parts than women. And so then they had everyone take off their shoes so you couldn't hear the high heels clicking across the stage as women went and sat down and played, and then it solved the problem.
So fucking interesting.
Isn't that crazy?
So interesting.
Yeah, it's wild. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a really interesting example. She's like super popular. She's really, really in the news, and it's great. It's great on so many levels, and it's such a complicated thing to unpack. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. And it's interesting because she's young. That's different. She's a woman. That's different. She comes from a diverse racial and cultural background. That's different. And so that difference, and she's approaching politics in a different way for who knows why. It could have all sorts of things to do with just there being that diversity now introduced into politics, and that's what this looks like. This is what changing politics looks like. And for that reason, she's getting so much attention, which is great because then you say, okay, hopefully people like her are looking at her and saying, she looks like me. She's just like me. She thinks like me. I've never felt like I could relate to politics before as a job, and now I do think that. And on the flip side, I would be really curious to hear about some of the backlash that she's getting and in a way that a lot of other politicians don't have to deal with.
She's essentially been, I actually think it reminds me of the classical music thing, which is interesting. Like you said, even just the knowledge that the high heels clicking on the stage, that person sits down, and then that's a woman, and your biases activate, and you just nitpick that person's playing to the point where you find a reason to not hire them over a man. That person takes their high heels off, and then suddenly you hire that person. Like the main thing around what's happening to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is that she's crazy accessible to people. She's really online. She tweets a lot. I'm just gonna destroy my throat here. I'm so
Whoa, God, it's a mess. It's a mess. What is happening?
I was gonna edit this out, but maybe now I have to keep it in.
What just came out of you?
It's like a tiny, wriggling alien. And she also is kind of becoming infamous for these Instagram live videos she's doing. Almost every lunch break or at dinner, she's at home making instant pot macaroni and cheese. And talking about Congress on Instagram Live, answering comments from people on Instagram Live. And you can just tune in and see what she's talking about.
Yeah.
And so she's making the government insanely accessible. One of the interesting things I think that I thought of while you were talking is that when you convince new people to run for office, even if they don't get elected, all of those people's networks suddenly like get activated in the political sphere in a way that they maybe wouldn't normally.
Yeah.
Like as someone who just won an election myself to the like governing council of my professional association, I had all of these friends of mine who were in my union writing me during the election who had never really thought about how the union is governed, how it worked, but all of a sudden I became the person that everyone wanted to. I became like the face of it, even though I wasn't even elected yet.
Yeah, right.
And I think that probably same effect happens for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and any women who run. Suddenly, to women who maybe had never considered themselves political actors, that whole sphere becomes activated.
And not just the people, but the actual like issues that they're thinking about too.
Yes.
Like the voices are heard in a way that now brings a whole bunch of different debate topics to light, and the election is framed around now their issues. Like they can actually bring them to the table in debates.
Totally. I've also I don't remember the name of it. Everyone who listens to this podcast knows that I love Malcolm Gladwell, and he's got this podcast.
Revisionist history.
Yeah. And in his podcast, he was one of the reasons I love what we're talking about right now is it kind of counteracts the sobering idea that he has, which is that he's like Barack Obama is the first black president and will be the only black president we have for 40 years, is what he says. And the first woman president we have will be the only female president we have for 40 years. And his argument is, and he goes into great detail as to why, but he says that when we have a black president, or when the United States has a black president, everybody goes, phew, we're not racist. Okay, now we can go back to having white presidents.
Yeah.
You know, and then and now the argument will become for 40 years. No, we're not racist. We elected Barack Obama in 2008 or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, like
Right.
and likewise, whereas, and that I think becomes less true. Again, when we're talking about the representation, like running versus being elected.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at Canada as a comparison. We've had one female prime minister, Kim Campbell, who was prime minister for about 3 months.
And
in
she wasn't
1990.
elected, right? Which is a tough,
exactly.
tough part of that.
Yeah, totally. And we're still waiting for the next one.
Yeah.
We had like 7 female premiers like 5 years ago, and now we're down to just one again.
Well, we haven't even had a woman running in the federal race yet for the prime minister. We haven't had a female leader of a party. I guess Elizabeth May counts, but she's the Green Party leader, and they're very marginal here. So like, there hasn't been a serious female contender ever for the prime ministership in an election.
Yeah, we have seen women running for leadership of parties, but
Yes.
they haven't won and they haven't made that step, and that's why, like, you look at the pipeline.
I voted for Joyce Murray instead of Justin Trudeau when I was still a liberal.
Totally. Yeah, and that's why you do have to look at the pipeline to realize that 20 to 25% of our politicians in Canada are women. That's even a little bit lower in the United States. Similar numbers in a lot of sort of quote unquote Western countries and democracies. And it's not because women aren't necessarily elected when they run. There are lots of little subtleties that we could get into around that, but it's mostly because women just aren't stepping up to run in the first place, and that's the problem that I want to tackle.
Yeah, one of the things, to loop back around to that classical music metaphor, so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been doing these Instagram live videos, and the kind of main thing that the right is doing is like just ruthlessly nitpicking them. And this is a woman who's literally cooking while she's just talking to people, and they'll just like leap on any tiny thing that she says that's wrong. Like she once referred to the 3 chambers of government and kind of like got them wrong in her head while she was like stirring her soup instead of the 3 branches of government. And they were like, she doesn't even know, it's like that 3-second clip was linked by all like these right-wing Fox News people, by even like Sarah Palin unironically linked it. It was like watch Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fail basic civics, and like kind of thing.
Right.
Where it's like, so I think that there's a perception that she needs to be held to this artificially high standard. Like she has to be literally perfect, or else she's like not worth listening to.
There's an MP. She's her name is Dr. Heidi Fry, and she's an MP for Vancouver Centre. Yeah. And she was one of the first non-white women elected to the House of Commons. And she's the longest standing woman MP, I think. She was elected in the early 90s. And she did an event once for us, and she said something that I just love. She said, the day that we start seeing mediocre women elected to office, we'll know we have made progress.
Yeah, it's true, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And she was the one who beat Kim Campbell in the race.
She did, yeah. Same.
But
same right.
it's an interesting thing too, the left-right dynamic around women in who run, because I think that part of the backlash against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is that she's really appealing. She's young, she's really accessible, she's like really informed and smart and fun, and she's very left-wing, and she really advocates left policies and articulates them super, super well and clearly. And especially in the U.S., like white women specifically are a really important part of the Republican voting bloc, and if they start to be spoken to on a left-wing policy level, I think that's quite dangerous for the right. So they have like an added need to discredit these kind of like young women running to kind of monopolize the conversation a little bit. Yeah, I don't know.
It is a
how
weird
that dynamic
artifact of
always
American,
plays, right? Like,
American politics, that there is this weird demographic of like privileged white women that vote in favor of things that aren't necessarily what you'd imagine as women's issues or like liberalist issues.
Voters are weird. They vote in ways that aren't necessarily in their interest, but it's such a fascinating thing to dive into. Coming in a jurisdiction that I'm more familiar with, Alberta, we've got an interesting situation where there's an NDP government right now, unheard of, as you know, as Canadians will be familiar with a female premier. It's the only female premier we have in Canada right now, and her caucus is 50% women because she ran a gender balanced slate of candidates. Yeah. So that made her cabinet gender balanced as well. And she's planning to do the same thing in Alberta's upcoming provincial elections. And so what that's done is because that conversation has become important to a voting bloc, the other provincial party leaders are talking about it as well and sort of boasting about their efforts to get more women running for their parties too, which is fantastic. Like
that is good.
It's sort of becoming a cross-partisan, sort of across the spectrum type of issue. And cynically, I guess, I think we're seeing politicians and party leaders see that as a strategic advantage, which is great,
great.
In making progress. And really what it comes down to is women need to be asked and recruited much more sort of overtly, I guess, than men do. A lot of men will just be asked once and say, yep, sign me up, or they'll just volunteer. Women need to be asked at least 3 times. And so that's what these party leaders, that's the pivotal role that they play in recruiting candidates. And so they've gone out and not only, I mean, at least they're talking about doing that. At least they're saying, yes, I'm trying to recruit women and I'm going to do it. And some are more successful than others, but having that conversation and women being able to hear that and saying, oh, I'm being sought out. It's these incremental little steps that are important.
It's kind of like Tesla, where like everyone laughed at Tesla, and then they started making a car that's actually great, and we learned that the consumers like actually want electric cars, and now every other car company is struggling to catch up with Tesla.
Yeah.
Then they have to buy all their batteries from Tesla.
Now Tesla's like buying all these closed GM factories. It's well, what a weird mistake. Yeah. So when's the last time you asked a woman if she would run?
I mean, it's hard to.
A question. The very nature of a question is
It's
a hard
a good
thing.
question though, because that's a lot of what I do now as part of this organization. Women, what we kind of say we try to do is open doors for women into politics, because the room has typically been open to men in so many ways, because the networks, right? Like you talked about it as well. What Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is doing is opening up her world and her network to politics. And that's what this organization that I'm part of is doing as well. And so when we say, okay, we're here for women in politics, sometimes people come knocking on our door, which is fantastic. And I get to sit down and say, have you ever thought about running for office? And usually you get sort of a chuckle, like a laugh, like, that's very funny, you're supposed to say that. And I go, like, no, have you? And then it becomes this actual discussion and this conversation about, like, yeah, women have thought about that. And it takes that question. It takes a serious Like, I'm not going to laugh back at you. We're going to talk about this.
Right.
And that is a conversation that I think if I can reach people to have that conversation with women they know, with women leaders in their communities, that's, I think, how we're really going to make a change. And when you start to reach party leaders and people within the party systems at our provincial and federal levels and in the United States and wherever, who are having those conversations, thinking about the women they know, thinking that we'll just make everyone stronger for a lot of different strategic reasons if we have these conversations with women. That's good.
And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was actually recruited by a left-leaning arm of the Democratic Party who was looking for good candidates, and she was recruited at the Standing Rock protests where she had gone to.
Well, I mean, this echoes sort of what we were talking about with the AI thing, as far as like you can't unlearn technology, right? Like or unlearn about the existence of technology, and so if you don't see representation in your government, it becomes a laughable thing. You go, well, but there's no one else like me who's doing it. But as soon as you see other people who are doing it, it becomes possible. It becomes a real technology that we can use moving forward.
Yeah.
And there's another musical analogy too, like things that were virtuosic and incredibly hard to play 150 years ago because somebody showed us how to play them, now are common parts of the repertoire. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a question: what do you say to women who are interested in running but are afraid of the harassment and the pressure and the sexism that they're sure to face, especially in a place like Alberta, which is like, I mean, you're much more diplomatic than me. I'm left-wing, I'm biased. That's what this show's always been about. But I will say that there is some ghoulish shit sometimes in Alberta, and it's like it's a pretty grim temperature for women online in politics in Alberta.
Yes.
So what do you say to them?
Man, that's a great question, and it's neck and neck with fundraising as the number one barrier, the systemic number one barrier for women in politics, and the reasons that they're hesitant to enter into that space, because they are unfairly targeted online with abusive tweets, essentially, is what it comes down to. And it's difficult to have that conversation, and you sort of go, okay, the reason this is happening is because of that difference. It's a change, it's a threat to people's worldview, and that's how people react. And so you sort of have to say, like, okay, look, there are a few things we can tell you. You know, one, there are people out there, including us, that have your back. I would say, like, us around this circle here, recording this podcast, and, you know, us as part of my organization, a lot of people who really want to see this change. Two, you know, you recognize that the world isn't fair, and that's kind of what we're trying to change. And three, you know, you have to make that decision for yourself. And it's really interesting because American politics in the last few years has changed so much about how women are making decisions. And we've seen that in America. We've seen it play out in Edmonton. One of the city councilors who just was elected last year to Edmonton City Council said, you know, I decided to run for a few different reasons. I was asked by some people who I know and respect, and they said, I'll help you. You know, not only am I going to ask you to run, but here, I'll introduce you to all my fundraising friends and all the people who can volunteer for you. But she also said, seeing and understanding how things could happen the way they have in America made me realize I had to step up. I had to do it. With all the connections I have, and even someone on our board right now, we talk a lot as a group about, between the six of us, have we ever thought about running for office? That's really an important part, I think, of what our organization should be doing, is having those conversations in and amongst ourselves and being a bit of a funnel of recruitment as well. And we often say, like, okay, with all the privileges that we have, and we're still hesitating, you know, we've got to step up. And you sort of start to talk about it in a way as, like, not only are you stepping up to run for office for all the good reasons you might want to do it and all the good policy ideas you have and the ways that you think you can use it to make the world a better place, but you're also a representative for all those women who might be looking at these barriers, knowing that they're harder to surmount for women than other people, and saying, okay, if I'm hesitating and I have all these advantages, imagine what everybody else must be thinking. And so it's sort of thinking about it in a way that you can make a difference in that realm as well as the other realms of society that you care about. And it's hard because you don't want to tell women to go into a position where they're uncomfortable and where they're almost knowingly setting themselves up for a difficult time.
Right.
But yeah, so it's a hard conversation to have, but that's what it sounds like a little bit.
Wow. Man, I know I keep bringing it back to this thing, but this is the big takeaway I'm taking from this, is the thing about getting more people to run versus getting more people to get elected. Because I'd never really, obviously I think about it in acting, as I told that story, but I'd never really considered it in the politics or business spheres as well. Because again, the issue I always have is like, when I have friends who are like, well, as a white man, maybe I shouldn't be auditioning for this part. Maybe it's time someone else does. I go, well, you can't take, I think it should be about empowerment and not about cutting your own destiny and your own dreams and your own wishes. Everybody should be able to pursue with their fullest extent their own thing. And so and again, I think this is where, if there's any right-wing people listening, I think this, I don't feel bad in saying, I think this is where you and we would get hung up on that. It's the lack of it's about empowerment versus deep powering.
Yes, that's a great point. I was sitting on a panel about a year ago, and I had a woman sitting in the audience ask a great question, and she said she's really involved in her community, thinking about running for city council, and thinking about herself as a white woman with the advantages she has. Should she be stepping back and encouraging maybe one of her colleagues or her fellow community contributors from, say, a racialized background or an Indigenous background, or any of those types of things? And I sort of go, I think it's more about there's no real, for the most part, no limit on the number of people who can run for office. And so I think, like, okay, in the audition context, bring someone with you, or ask, sort of share your knowledge in lots of different ways. People have access and privileges that they can use to help empower others. And I think maybe in some cases it's about stepping back, but not in all cases. It's sort of how can we all move forward together? And I also like that because it's less risky in terms of antagonizing those people who might be able to help you.
Yeah, and the easiest place to make change from is the table. Yeah. So stepping back from the table so that there's a spot doesn't connect more people to it. You lose your decision making. Yeah. Bringing someone else to the table.
Exactly. It's one tool. It's one tool we can think about making space at the table, and how do we do that in lots of different ways. Maybe sometimes it is taking a step back. Maybe it's inviting people. Maybe it's making the table bigger. I don't know. And then the other thing we like to do as a part of our organization is we throw parties called win, lose, or draw parties. And it's celebrating anyone who steps forward to run, because you're winning. If you're stepping forward, you've signed up to run, and you've run a campaign, and you've just had a fantastic experience. Whether or not you won or lost the election, you've won already by running in the first place. And so that's kind of the approach that we take.
Yeah, I just love the idea that everyone should consider themselves a political actor. Everyone should consider themselves a person who has a stake in society and the potential to become deeply involved in it. I think that's something that we have been losing a little bit. There is a strong generational gap. I'm in a lot of activist circles, and there is a missing generation of left activists and stuff like that. I think there's a generation that became heavily invested in individualism and don't really think of themselves as being able to pull those levers and manipulate those systems that somebody else will do it. And I think that that's beginning to change now. And again, it's just the example that I'm using, but the governing council of my professional association has had tons of women elected in this last election, and largely galvanized from the Me Too movement, which obviously is huge in our industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's a lot of concerted drive for change behind that. I am, there's 7 of us elected from Ontario, and 2 of us are men.
Yeah.
It's awful that it has to come to that point for change to happen.
Yeah, but I was reading this thing that was, this is sort of a bit more somber, but I was reading this thing that was talking about the way men hear sound, and the way and the pitch most women's voices hit registers as music for a lot of men, and it's easy to tune out biologically. And it's not an undoable thing, but it takes a conscious effort
Wow.
on an individual basis to like understand what you're doing. And like
I would like to see that study. I don't know.
Sure.
I feel skeptical about it.
sure.
What kind of headphones were they?
Yeah, I mean, this was something I just read on the internet, so who knows if it's right.
I've got
But-
a study also about the profs I had at university.
Sure.
How
Speaking of the
easy it
pitch of
was.
music. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
The point I'm making though is that it's an individual's opportunity to change their own mind versus like it's not not necessarily there are, as you say, like the click of the heels in the orchestra leads people to make sexist decisions. And I doubt that it's very much like them being like, oh, that's a lady. I can tell by the shoes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to choose them.
Unconscious
It's more of
bias.
it's an
it's
unconscious bias, and it takes a conscious effort on an individual basis, which is like the scary and frustrating thing is that you realize how many people have fucked up opinions, how many people are afraid to register bias in themselves, who are like how many people are afraid to say, oh, I have these, I have these biases and I am in charge of changing them.
Yeah.
Like that's a scary thing, but also a hopeful thing, knowing that like there's organizations like yours and podcasts like ours and like and things of that nature that are attempting to just make the universe look at itself a little bit. Make people see themselves for what they are and the actions they're taking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Unconscious bias is a huge thing, and I don't know. I've got a theory that that's where the discomfort comes in. Having to bring that to your consciousness is like it's like hard. It's sort of uncomfortable, and then thinking about how to change it and feeling like maybe you don't have the tools, and what do you do about it? It's like change is scary for people, and it's uncomfortable, and that's understandable. And I think allowing ourselves to be okay with that is probably one of the first.
Well, and we're a generation that's still in transition from kind of the feminist movement that our parents' generation fought, right? So we're still working with inherited and received images from like how society is supposed to function in a super gendered way, like the kind of like images and the social order of like the 50s, which started to kind of be really deeply questioned and broken apart in the 60s, we actually still kind of have a foot there. I think that like the people who are born in our generation right now are going to inherit and receive very different images than we did, and they'll be able to hopefully like ride over those humps a little more gracefully than we will. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. The tapestry of gender kind of changes based on how you inherit the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Lots to do.
Yeah, lots to do.
So what's the goal? What's the next goal?
I mean,
You talked about your early goal.
yeah, the call to action here
Yeah.
is to think about women who are active in their communities and ask them if they thought about running for office, and then when they laugh, just ask them again.
Yeah. And then ask them a third time.
And then ask
Make
them
sure
a
you
third
ask them
time.
the third time.
Yeah, exactly.
Because women's brains, blank, blank, blank.
I was gonna say because women are like characters in a 1990s adventure game. You have to ask them 3 times.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
right.
Let
It's
it in.
Easter eggs. It's
It's
all
like the
Easter
man
eggs.
don't give up. There's something in Jewish tradition about that too.
Of course, yeah. When you're asked to convert, when you try to convert into Judaism,
right.
the rabbi will be like, absolutely not. And that turns some people away, and you have to ask 3 times, and then the rabbi will actually take you seriously in terms of like coming into the faith.
Right,
Yeah.
like a vampire.
Rabbis are a lot like vampires.
Yeah,
They pray all day. That's a vampire thing.
totally. Yeah. So and so what we've got going on right now is something on our website that's tallying the number of women who have been nominated to run in Alberta for the different parties. So we've broken it down by party, and it's an interesting time because the election will probably be in the spring, and so parties are like right in the mix of nominating candidates to run for provincial election. And then we'll see what happens at the federal level. So already there's lots of activity at the federal level for parties nominating candidates to run. I hope that someone somewhere, and maybe it's got to be us again, is keeping track of the number of women who are being nominated and the different actions that different parties are taking to try to right the scales, I guess. And then in Edmonton, what we'll be looking at as well is the municipal election, which is coming up in 2021, very specifically to try to recruit more women to run there. And there are no parties involved in Edmonton at the municipal level, so it's a little bit of a different game. But yeah, we want to see lots of women running and hopefully running against each other. And the cool thing about that, too, is that when there are more women involved, that changes the race a little bit. There was one particular race in our last municipal election in Edmonton where there were 5 just amazing women running, and they were really able to focus on the issues again and talk about policy. And it feels like in politics we're losing a lot of that now because social media, what goes viral and what gets picked up is a lot of this nitpicking and attacking, and we're losing conversations about policy when you do that.
I mean, we elected a government in Ontario that literally had no policies.
Yeah.
It turns out their policies are like the same policies as your average James Bond villain.
Get James Bond.
It's like, I will destroy the green belt. Like, I will dump toxic waste in the river if it's the last thing I do.
I think the survey data or the analytics that you're doing is that mirror that you're talking about, that like the reflection on society of like, yep, here's the numbers. Now take that in and realize that there aren't that number running and there should be. And this is like in black and white for party leaders to see that this is the moment to step forward.
Well, and it's a really convenient thing to be able to say to a party leader who says, 40% of our candidates are women. It's like, actually, you're at 30% right now. But hopefully you meant 40% as a goal, and I'll just suggest you make that 50%, and that's great.
Right. Cool.
Well,
okay, so where can people find you on the internet if they want to learn more about parityyeg?
Parityyeg.ca.
Pronounce that T. Make sure you pronounce that T.
Parity, as in equality. Yes, parityyeg.ca. We've got our counter there for the Alberta provincial election. Lots of good information and blog posts and things, information about events if you're kind of in the area, or if you're interested in donating or volunteering or anything like that, you can do all that.
Or creating your own regional parity, gender parity organization.
100%. Yes. Thumbs up.
Get involved. Track the data.
Yeah, start your own province. See what that's like.
Yeah, that's right. Make your own religion. You're a god.
Empower.
Don't let the patriarchy tell you you're not a living deity.
Right now, you're just like reenacting the white noise machine Mark Zuckerberg listens to go to sleep.
That's right.
Change the world. Be the world. Be the change.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lana, for coming on, and to Kory as well for joining us again.
If you like this, you do like this podcast. You support it with money, which is the most love you can give us.
So feel free anytime. Throw us a comment, question, suggestion for future topic. We always listen. We read everything.
Until next time, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
I'm Kory.
I'm Lana.
And this has been Explain It to Jamie. Woo!